Pleasure to introduce Kris Wrona. We met not long ago, a month or two ago, at a mindfulness conference and got to talking over lunch or something. And what I discovered is that Kris not only works in the Department for Education, with whom many of us have collaborative projects, but that he does research on growth mindset. And that's an area that I think is of great interest to many of us in our projects. And there's very little of this work apparently done in Australia. I know Kris's research interests are much broader and his practice interests, and he'll tell us more about that. But I think the growth mindset is one of the particular reasons I wanted him to speak to us here. And I also love the fact that Kris, when I asked him, how does growth mindset relate to self-concept? His answer was something like, oh, well, it was only when I read Herb Marsh's work on self-concept that I really understood what this is all about. So, yeah, I look forward to hearing you, Kris. Thanks.
It was certainly true when I was trying to look at belief systems and things like that. It wasn't really gelling with me until I looked at the development of self-concept, from that sort of age of 10 onwards, and thinking about how it's unified to a differentiated process. And I thought, it makes sense. So, or made more sense. So, so obviously my background is as a psychologist within the Department of Education, so it's more practical based, I should say. More recently though, I've moved into looking at research, so I'm probably talking to all researchers, and that's quite scary for me because by comparison my research is probably not to your standards, but it's more in the applied side of things. So the research I did very recently, so I finished it last year on growth mindset, was as part of a postgraduate student doing a Master's of Research through Macquarie University. So just a quick overview, just talk a little bit about my interests in mindset, a little bit about the concept and the sort of what it is. So in terms of response patterns, goal orientations, the development and how it sort of comes about with children. A little bit of some research findings and a critique of those, because I want to give a balanced sort of presentation today. And then a little bit about the study that I did, so a little bit about the design, the findings, the implications, and some questions. Questions are really important because that shows the gaps I have in my knowledge, and I think when people ask those questions it helps me to go back and refine and review and look at those different things. Now I think, to start with, so one thing I just wanted to sort of start with is something that I sort of came across recently, which was the idea of this Stanford I Screwed Up project, which they run, this resilience program. And I know universities are running all different things. I saw the 5 ways to wellbeing here, which I thought was great. But I think this one was particularly good, and it talks to that idea of the duck syndrome. We see the postgraduate, or in my case, the high school students gliding effortlessly across the water, not to realise they're paddling madly and frantically underneath, and they're quite struggling in many cases. And it's sort of those beliefs that they have about their abilities, which can be one part in that sort of problem. So one of the things that they have, and hopefully the little video will play, they have a little video about this, and they get videos from students and they get videos from academic staff, and this was one, and I like this, and it's good that it starts the presentation, because it's probably a little bit how I feel sometimes as well. So it's just a little 4-minute clip. Yeah.
I was probably you could say a phenomenal kind of failure as a young man. I went to rural high school in Washington State, where even in that academically debased atmosphere, I couldn't seem to get better than B's and C's. I eventually, I admit, dishonest means, got myself a scholarship to a very fine prep school in Pennsylvania, where I did rather well in what I like, which is reading and writing, but really found it hard to come up to the scratch, come up to the standard expected of students there in science and math. And I eventually, after some years there, lost my scholarship and had to leave. And this was quite a blow for me. I loved the school. I was looking forward to graduating with my class and going on to a good university. In the event, what I ended up doing was not ever getting a high school diploma and going into the Army at the age of 18. So at that point in my life, I was looking at myself with some skepticism and looking at my future with some skepticism and wondering if I really had the stuff to do the things that I wanted to do in this world, because I had no evidence to support any idea that I did. The outlook, I thought, for myself was pretty grim. But I did manage, in fact, to do many, if not most of the things that I wanted to do in life, which was to become a writer, become a teacher, have a family. And I did this, I think, not because I looked at myself and thought, oh, what a dismal creature you are, forget about it, you're never going to be able to do this, but to just take a step back and just do what I needed to do as well as I could do it from day to day. And certainly as a writer, when I write a short story, for example, my first drafts are awful. If I ever let anybody see the rough drafts of the stories that I write, they would wonder why I ever decided that I was a writer. They're very experimental. I change things constantly. I write bad sentences, but I know I'm going to go back. And I do, again and again and again. And I keep revising and changing things and finding new ways of approaching the material until after, usually some weeks, I arrive at a draft that I'm really, really happy with. It isn't a way to get a whole lot of stories written, but I've written now 4 books of stories over the years. And it's, as I say, I think the key to digging yourself out of a hole is to not put a terrible weight of expectation on yourself to do a whole lot of things right away, but to just manage a little bit every day, do what you can do every day, do it patiently, do it with an eye to doing it excellently, and work at that kind of incremental overcoming of our initial awkwardnesses, and if you want to call them failures, call them that. I just call them drafts. Our life is a draft. It's constantly in revision, and we can make it better. Maybe we can even bring it close to something beautiful if we allow ourselves the room to do it.
Yeah, so definitely for me, the idea of the drafts and the effort and the incremental change, because that's obviously quite central to the idea of the growth mindset, so those incremental changes. And I think just acknowledging that failure is actually the draft, that's the really important thing. That's where we probably learn a lot from. So yeah, certainly I think gives a good tone to what I'll be talking about throughout this presentation. So just my interests. As a psychologist that we're doing, a lot of cognitive assessments, IQ tests over the last 10 years, sometimes I would find that it's hard to account for achievement discrepancies following an IQ test. We'd look at the usual kinds of things, ADHD, no. It might be a language delay, no, that's not an issue. No developmental trauma, no, that wasn't the reason to account for it. It wasn't a phonological awareness problem. Sometimes it really just is the fact around understanding motivation and understanding that on the day of testing, for whatever reason the child wasn't engaged with the test, and that that becomes the issue of then how do I go back and give some really useful information to the teacher to help that child achieve their curriculum outcomes, but then also giving the parents some useful advice too. So sometimes so that is an issue, and then this can help me to understand that a little bit in terms of my practice. Again, as a psychologist, we have things like motivational interviewing. We know that motivation and getting people to move through that trans-theoretical model of change, it's really important. And if it works in the counselling context, well, maybe it should work in the educative context too. So, looking at some of those approaches just to understand how students' beliefs, thoughts influence their beliefs and behaviours and feelings, and translating that to the learning side of things. And again, to be honest, probably schools maybe with the exception of the last couple of years, have always really been focused on learning over well-being kind of things. So trying to integrate or trying to focus solely on well-being without looking at the benefit for learning can be a bit hard to get traction in schools. At least sometimes you can find that. I think there's obviously, as I said, over the last couple of years, a whole lot more interest, particularly in my department, in the New South Wales Department of Education, where we've brought out a whole framework about wellbeing, and it's really been integrated across the whole school plan. But that's quite recent, I suppose. And then as a father of a 3-year-old boy, you really notice how easy it is to fall into the trap of a person praising. So saying to your little child, so this is my little boy Hugo playing trains, and there's always going to be a bit of a dilemma when it comes to, or a challenge when it comes to building a track that won't go the way it's supposed to go, and I don't want to try anymore, and sort of giving up. And when they get it right, it's so hard to not say, oh, you're so clever, oh, you're so smart, you're just so bright. And I suppose you start to see that early on, as opposed to saying, or what we try to do is, in our parenting style, is to say, oh, you tried so well at that, or good practice, keep practicing, and try to encourage the engagement that way. And I suppose, just as another sort of anecdote, recently, in my little boy's 4 in July, but start of the year when he was going to preschool, so not preschool, not before school, it's playgroup, so the younger one again. He got a mozzie bite on his ear, and his ear just swelled up huge. We saw him in the morning and we're like, whoa, it just looked like he sort of grew this extra thing here. And we put an ice pack on it in the morning and tied it up with a dressing gown robe, and he's got this thing stuck on his head there. And we said, okay, so we've got to do this, we're ready for school. He's like, no, I'm not going to school, the children will tease me. And it really just sort of brought to me the idea that he was already aware of that idea of fitting in and not fitting in, and belonging and not belonging at 3.5. So we know that these little kids are sponges, and I guess then for me, if I'm praising him always for just being good or great and not for trying, I'm going to start to see how that might pan out by the time he's 7, 8, 9 or 10, or even early on. So obviously the other thing that we notice now is that we hear a lot about these 21st century learning skills. We hear in the media this idea that to succeed globally as Australia or other countries move towards this so-called knowledge-based economy where patents are kind of the king. Students are going to need new learning skills, and part of that might be having the right mindset. So one of the things I know that the department they invested a little bit of money in was from the curriculum, the Centre of Curriculum Redesign, where they've looked at some of these new skills, and this is the 21st century skills, which are somewhat suggesting might be quite important as we move forward. I suppose, encompassing all of that, down the bottom is this idea that a growth mindset is probably something that would be important for these 21st century learners. I think, again, just some general media, we hear it we hear it in a couple of spaces quite regularly. It's sort of around the political economic sphere, where we hear that as the national, for example, the national shift away from a fear of failure to a spirit of innovation will require significant change in behaviours and mindset. Again, the fear of failure that lies deep within the Australian mindset, and we often hear about the Turnbull mindset and his approach to innovation and can-do. So that's in the political space, and I think again the other place you'd always hear it is during like a major sporting event, an Olympic athlete's mindset, or a World Cup sort of an event. I don't know, that they've probably got the truth behind what a mindset is, so it's used quite loosely. But I think there's some elements there which are probably relevant. I suppose then what it comes down to is this idea that mindsets then do matter, that there seems to be some importance for them. That's certainly the way the research is showing. And I think that the crux of it has been that problem, and I sort of touched on it a little bit with my experience with sort of testing students, is that, how is it that students of matched academic ability perform differently on the same learning task? And there's lots of reasons, and I know I've sort of said, you know, there could be those learning difficulties or those low SES status, or there could be a whole bunch of things that could sort of account for that. But certainly, you know, when I'm in the classroom and we're in the classroom, we can see that these kids that can do it sometimes and they can't do it other times, and we're trying to understand what's going on with that. Perhaps one of the things that might be at play there is the mindset of the child. So I think, you know, the research is showing that the teacher's ability to affect academic improvements are influenced by the mindsets, and that what mindset a child brings or a student brings to their learning environment is going to have some influence on that. So mindsets, you know, what are they? They're the beliefs that students hold about their abilities, their learning abilities, which influence their motivation, academic achievement, and some recent research around wellbeing as well. So just, I guess very simply, a fixed mindset is where a student or a child believes that their intelligence is something that's static. It's the way they're born. There's not much, if anything, they can do about it. Effort won't make a difference. Some of the research has sort of found, you know, that giving up on that students with a fixed mindset are more likely to give up on a difficult task, verbalise more self-denigrating comments, and describe their ways to explain their problem-solving ability. So, you know, that internalising of "I'm dumb," or even verbally externalising that, "I can't do it, I'm dumb, I'm not smart enough." Some research shows that they would more likely cheat on the next task, learning task or test, rather than fail. Some research shows that they're more likely to self-report or actually achieve lower grades on subjects and across, longitudinally. This study, an Australian study, shows that they're more likely to truant and disengage from school. And more recently, they've looked at fixed and growth beliefs about emotions. So some of that research has suggested that that those students with a fixed view of emotion are going to have lower levels of psychological well-being. Students with a growth mindset, on the other hand, tend to believe that ability is malleable, so it's something that can change. I think the important thing is change with effort, so having the effort and applying effort. The research is showing that they achieve higher GPAs, tend to select more challenging subjects with deeper learning goals, can transition better from primary school through to high school, less likely to drop out or truant, and conversely experience having a growth view of emotion, experience higher levels of psychological well-being. I suppose there's one thing that's probably important to point out is when we talk about a growth and a fixed mindset, the proper banner, and I'll have a little slide here that fits that. The proper sort of heading is the implicit theories of intelligence. So that's, I think, the research uses it fairly interchangeably. We often hear now growth and fixed mindset. More formally, before that, they would talk about implicit theories of intelligence. And on the growth side, they would say an incremental theory, and on the fixed side, they would say an entity theory of intelligence. So I suppose it's just important to point that out, and that implicit and explicit theories would be different. So I guess what we're looking at is we're not really talking about, in that case, explicit theories, which are probably more akin with cognitive assessment or IQ and those types of things. That would be a different area of intelligence. So I think, the best way to explain it is those lay theories of intelligence, the common beliefs or assumptions that people hold about their own and others' abilities. And that's, as I said, that's the idea. So implicit theories, they're not about IQ or explicit intelligence. An incremental aligns with growth and entity aligns with fixed. So if you see that in the literature, they're just, as I said, they're used interchangeably. I guess from when I started out looking at this, some of the problems were, of course, and probably there's some people asking or thinking this, whether intellectual ability or IQ is fixed remains an area of contention. General intelligence, as captured by an IQ test, tends to remain stable over time. I would probably say, certainly with my experience having administered, a lot of IQ tests, I generally find that to be the case. The exception would be young children, where there's more variability, in IQ test scores, but generally speaking, you know, when you test a person, they tend to fall in that same range if we're testing for example, intellectual disability. As I said, younger children, probably the most common profile where I see a big change is younger children that have moderate intellectual delay with autism. And I think early on it was probably because of the impairment in communication. It was really hard to get an accurate measure of their IQ, and it wouldn't be uncommon for us to see sort of 15 to 30 points increase in an IQ score following substantial early intervention. So that would be the only thing. So I can't argue with the fact that, yeah, IQ tends to remain fairly stable, but we're not talking about that side of explicit intelligence. We're talking about those late theories. I think though, there's a question.
What's the correlation between IQ and mindset?
Yeah, so that's kind of really interesting one. I know the Fonska's work, he looked at, he actually did look at a study, or did a little research project where he did take one subtest out of the Weschler Children's Intelligence Test. It was a processing speed test, and did have students complete that pre and post a mindset task, and did find that those that received the sort of the growth intervention achieved better the second time. But you know, obviously there could be learning effects and those types of things. But it would suggest that maybe the beliefs that a person's holding and taking into the task probably are going to limit their performance to some extent.
But
So,
in the school population, what's the correlation between mindset and intelligence?
I've got a little bit of a slide that sort of shows that, but I'm honestly not really aware of that. So that's probably a really good thing to point out. Yeah, so I know with one study they have sort of looked a little bit at it, but I think generally they've stayed away with explicit and implicit intelligence. I think it would be quite messy and hard otherwise. In terms of just, you know, the development, this is just a snapshot of some of those type of precursors. Gunderson found that the amount of process praise, so good try, parents gave significantly predicted children's self-theory that intelligence was malleable so that it could change. And these studies were sort of based on very young kids. So if I just go here, this was looking at process praise for children aged around about 2 to 3 years was a predictor when they were at 7 or 8. So, you know, again, an important thing. Pomazant and Kemper showed that as maternally delivered person praised you were smart increased, so too did a child's fixed view of intelligence, and those ages were around about the same time, so up to around about, I guess, 8 years of age as well. So, you know, I guess we're hearing a bit about the importance of feedback for young children here. Hakadoa, I think it is, and Finchman found that mothers of, and they're talking learned helplessness, so learned helpless children showed less positive affect and fewer mastery-oriented teaching strategies when their child experienced setbacks. So I guess that's sort of getting to the idea whether it might be that the children sort of, you know, where might those sort of young kids get that response pattern from, you know, and it's not sort of mum blaming or parent blaming, but I guess that kind of feedback that we give to young kids probably can impact on their response and how they respond to success or not success and the types of beliefs that they might. Yes.
Are you looking at mindset as a bipolar construct where you know, it's positive, negative, and it's one construct, or are you looking at it as two separate constructs, or
On a continuum, yeah. And I think that's been looked at in different ways, and it's been looked at in different contexts. So in that way, yes, more along just the single unit, the single dimension. Yeah. And Heyman found that, you know, preschoolers were more likely, and again that was sort of the analogy that I explained. Found that preschoolers were more likely to rate a child as being smart. Who found the task easy compared to another child that finds the same task difficult. So, you know, that was kind of what I was saying with my little boy, who sort of was all that, you know, bringing up the idea of I don't want to get teased. You know, I'm already starting to differentiate between fitting in and not fitting in. So I suppose overall what I found was that feedback was was a really important component there. And I think we know that from teaching, that teachers need to give students very explicit feedback. But it's also that right kind of feedback. So, you know, even in IQ tests, you know, when we're going to give feedback on performance, it always needs to be on there, not on the person praise. It really needs to be good try, keep trying at that task. I know that was a hard one, but see, maybe the next one's easier. So we're not sort of, you know, going into an assessment, or as a teacher, if we can avoid trying to say to kids, it's because you're so clever, that's why you can do it, to sort of encourage them for the process. Again, you know, obviously the family and the school or preschool would be an important sort of influence in the development of those beliefs that children have, particularly at that young age. And I suppose the earlier that we, you know, can sort of mould kids in a helpful way, the better. You know, sort of preschool teachers, young early childcare teachers, or parents, you know, if they can do those types of things. And I guess, as I said, I find it really hard. I find it really hard not to just say to my little boy, "You're so clever, you're so smart," especially when they're building a block tower and they've done it for the first time and you're just so ecstatic with it.
So, maybe you've already covered this, but have there been studies of the teacher's mindset and how that influences the child?
Not as much. It wasn't something that I looked at a lot in my project as well, but I certainly didn't find as much of it. I know there has been some studies which have, and that's I think an area that would be really interesting to look at, you know, how the mindset of the teacher correlates with that of the student, and, you know, does it or does it not? Or even at a school, like what about the mindset of an overall school, and then of the individual student in that school or the teacher?
If we take a group of teachers, do we know, on average, somewhere or other, US, you know, Australia, wherever, what percentage would have a fixed mindset?
The population data tends to show a 40 split, so that you know, overall 40 will have a growth mindset, just in general, not just teachers. 40 will have a growth mindset, 40 will have a fixed mindset, and 20 will have an undecided mindset. So they're sort of sitting on the fence a little bit.
We don't know specifically for teachers, who we hope would have a, you know, growth mindset.
There was a study that looked at UK and I think it was like Serbian teachers around about 2013, and that found roughly that trend as well, which is the same trend that the general population studies would show. But yeah, I think that's an important thing. I know that that when I've sort of talked about this, the interest has been, well, you know, thinking about what then can we help teachers with their professional development, or what can we look at in terms of the teacher mindset.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
No.
And go down a bit of an alley. I don't know the mindset literature at all, but it's sort of reminiscent of attributional styles and attributional theory. So is this just another version of that, or is this something quite distinctive? Or?
No, I think it definitely draws on those types of things. So like the work of Weiner or Kelly in terms of personal construct theory, even Seligman's work on learned helplessness, and then the way that explanatory styles would then sort of be used to make sense of some of that. It is very much well drawn on those types of research, completely so.
Okay.
Yeah.
In goal theory as well.
And certainly the huge thing that is goal theory. Yeah. That huge body of work there too.
Because we're already asking questions. You connected this research to self-concept, and I have two questions. First of all, would you consider growth mindset or not growth mindset as multidimensional? And also, is growth mindset in itself able to change over time or fluctuates? Is there a state and a trait?
I looked at self-concept because it actually made more sense for me than looking at just implicit beliefs or lay beliefs and belief systems. But that was an important part. Having some background knowledge in attribution theory and explanatory styles certainly helped from a psychology background. The self-concept really helped. I'm afraid this is on video, but I didn't necessarily find that Dweck explained it as well as the other research did. Maybe because she made reference to those findings. I suppose they would refer it to as a trait in answer to the second question. And in terms of can it change, yes it can. They say the research is showing that yes they can change, the mindsets can change. But there are some critiques which I'll bring up, and I'll just sort of to bring to introduce you to that. There's not really a lot that's looked at the change in mindsets or how they've been maintained over time. And I'll get to that. So that's, I think, yeah, that's a really good question to ask and a problem to sort of navigate. So I guess, and I think this is where we're looking at in terms of response patterns and maybe attribution. So what the model kind of shows then is that children will develop a helpless or a mastery-oriented response pattern that's going to affect their beliefs about intelligence and academic behaviour. So some research has found that 5th grade students praised for ability are more likely to develop a fixed mindset and demonstrate more helpless. And we're talking about learned helpless, so helpless response patterns. It's too hard, I can't do it, those kinds of response patterns. Whereas students with helpless response patterns tend to hold a negative biasing towards task failure over task success when asked to report performance ability. Even if past performance was good, there's still a biasing they've found. I suppose in contrast, so the mastery-oriented response shows that students will embrace challenge, maintain and adjust their task regulation, and activate a broad range of strategies to help them overcome setbacks. These students are less likely to demonstrate negative affect and employ fewer task avoidance or self-handicapping strategies, and they're more likely to view challenging problems and failures as part and parcel of life, as drafts, I think, as the video showed, and something that we can master with increased effort. Again, increased effort. It doesn't just happen. It has to come through the effort that the student puts into it. I think people kind of, when they pick it up with this idea of mindset, they sort of just don't really pay much attention to the idea that effort is really important, that it's not just going to happen on its own. And then in terms of goal orientation, and that's a huge, or goal theory, that's a huge area in itself. What they tend to find, what the research tends to find, is that students that hold either a hopeless or mastery-oriented response pattern tend to view the world, or themselves in different ways. So each appears to be governed by a different, lay theory or implicit rule system that shapes their framework of interpreting and responding to the academic tasks or failures. So the research shows that students who view academic tasks through the performance lens tend to be focusing on proving their ability correctly or correctly answering questions and gaining praise from others. They're less likely to engage in sort of riskier learning tasks or tasks where there's a high chance of failure, but a payoff of that might be that they're going to learn something new and develop some new knowledge, or acquire some new knowledge. On the other hand, sort of those students that are oriented more towards that mastery or those learning goals tend to be pursuing learning goals. They're more concerned with improving their ability rather than proving. So that's the difference. They often say proving or improving their abilities. They're more interested in figuring out new strategies. These students tend to recognise that they're going to have to put effort in to overcome setbacks, and they value what comes into gaining new knowledge. I suppose from that VIA side of things, they might rate highly on the love of learning or curiosity, those types of strengths. And then I guess as a sort of an overview, so we sort of talked about the idea that sort of feedback might influence their understanding, their schema of themselves, their implicit beliefs. They tend to sort of move them towards a mastery or a helpless response pattern, where there are sort of different goals that are associated with that, and then different mindsets. So that's often how the research sort of presents the model or the process. Yes.
Would you prefer me to save the questions afterwards or ask it now?
No, it's fine.
I was just thinking also back to what Evan was saying about whether you measure it on a continuum or not. One of the things I'm noticing that psychologists do a lot is measure things on a continuum and then talk about them as if they're categorical. And so, talking about this, the inner economist in me says that when the objective growth mindset matches up with the subjective growth mindset, that would be the best thing. So there has to be some kind of non-linearity. There can be too much growth mindset. But I'd like it to be linear. Is there any evidence of whether growth mindset is non-linear or linearly related to well-being or self-concept or those sorts of things?
that's a question I'm probably not going to be able to probably answer, but I know that there had been, I guess in terms of the first, taking like a scale or creating a scale from questionnaires, yes, you're right, psychologists do that all the time, and I don't have the answer to that. I still don't know what the difference is between a 4 and a 5 on a depression scale. I don't think you'll find somebody that can probably give you the answer to that sort of conundrum. It's just, I know I've used it the same way. That's the way that it tends to be used. You're taking, converting the scores into a scale in terms of then how it correlates with well-being. There's only been a few studies that I've looked at where they then looked at implicit beliefs about emotions and the fixed and the malleable nature of them. Not too sure about objective and subjective measures as well.
What's an objective measure?
What I mean is that IQ is presumably to some degree fixed or some degree malleable. So there's a real point at which it really is malleable to some degree or not, right? I mean, there is an objective.
It's not so much IQ as performance.
There is an objective reality. Well, it might be objectively malleable. I don't know. What I'm saying is that there's some real point, and that might vary from person to person, but there is some real point.
Mm-hmm.
And presumably, the thing that is most conducive to well-being is when people hold a subjective view of that, which matches their objective reality.
I suspect that that's too simplistic in this sense, because I don't think that the mindset is one-to-one or even intended to be one-to-one with intelligence, or even maybe if you talk about the extent to which intelligence is changeable as an individual difference variable, that gets pretty tricky to even conceptualize, let alone measure.
Also, holding positive illusions can be good for well-being.
But we're attributing a lot of things to this theory that aren't in that theory. It begins with an idea that this is about a fixed intelligence versus incremental. We can, in this room, modify the theory to now make it make sense, but I'm just trying to stick with the words too, and one would want to stick with the words. So if it's about performance, then it should be about a fixed versus incremental performance. It shouldn't be about intelligence. It shouldn't convey that that's the issue. If that's the issue, that's a different issue, and it may be illusory to think you can move your intelligence all over the map. But performance may be a different question, and then we ask, what is it in settings that would lead you to have no belief that your efforts will make a difference in performance? That becomes a whole different psychology than about my intelligence. And so, it's just
when you start looking at it from a perspective of self-concept, it even gets more messy, because if you do well, you may have a vested interest in having a fixed entity. And so I don't think that you can say that. Mindset becomes more fixed with age. There's a fairly strong developmental trend. And whether you can actually differentiate, I mean, you've got a hierarchy from helpless to performance to fixed mindset, but actually whether you can distinguish between those constructs or not is pretty questionable. I use that when I talk about jingle-jangle fallacies, in terms of whether different researchers use them. But when you actually put all the measures together into one study and try and see whether you can actually differentiate them, it gets pretty messy.
And one thing I've also thought of in that space is just sort of thinking about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. I mean, I tend to think that shows quite well that matched students without the aiding of an assistant probably will perform the same way, but there's a difference with a little bit of help between how they'll perform with that little bit of help. So it does show that ability even can vary, or their potential for ability can vary differently. So I guess they've got different potential, different growth rates. It's just tricky. It's a pretty sort of.
And I wonder, I know that if they talk about theories of intelligence, but if you look at even the items or the discussion or everything like that, it's really performance.
Yes.
Because that's where the motivational stuff comes in.
And yeah. So, and there's probably a case for other motivational models as well that might explain it as well, or STD and things like that too. Very very fortunate to have come across that as a model. Not really taught much in Australia, in Australian universities. So at least years ago when I was sort of doing my undergraduate work. So I sort of look at that and think, oh, maybe there's some other things that you could look at too.
Wait, there are other models of motivation?
So just in terms of the intervention science itself, there's been sort of an increasing trend to deliver programs in a brief and scaled format, consisting of very few lessons. This is within the educational context, and delivering them either online or to scores of students, to thousands of students. And the rationale behind these type of process now is that these large-scale interventions, they want to move beyond, I suppose, that highly controlled, very costly research study which gets published thousands of times a year, which works, but I suppose the hard thing is, how do you scale that? How do you upscale that kind of an intervention? Certainly, when I was working in the Department of Education at the State Office, we would get so many, either through SERAP or otherwise, people that were interested in doing research projects. But the problem was, how do you scale it? And there's the money to do them is just not there. So that's certainly something that's come about, and that's something where I think they've really embraced that quite well in the mindset research over the last probably four or so years. And the research in that space has shown that whether it's delivered in class or online, the benefits seem to be quite similar. So that's, I think, something to always consider. So that either is able to support an incremental or a growth mindset. And I suppose I'll just put this here, I don't think it's just education. In 2015, the New South Wales Health Department brought out a policy around increasing the scale of population health interventions as well. So people do want to look at, there is that trend on scalable interventions where I suppose that the better ones are even looking at the return on investment. So they actually do some, and I have no knowledge about this, but that economic modelling, I don't know if you're the economist here, they look at that economic modelling at the back of the paper, and I say, well, this is how much it cost per student almost, the intervention, this was the benefit of it. If the student failed these subjects, this would be the cost to the economy, and they sort of do some fancy things which grabs people's attention. Not knowing anything about economics, I suspect it's all true, but I don't know.
When you're talking about the benefits of these interventions, are you talking about self-report measures or performance measures?
Then against performance measures.
Oh,
yeah. So, sorry about that. Just in terms of then some intervention results, because prior to the interventions studies, which probably started largely from 2007 with Blackwell's paper, which looked at the longitudinal benefits of an incremental theory of intelligence. There was only a few sort of papers. I think Aronson's paper in 2003 might have been one of the first ones. But I guess then in terms of the outcome measures, what they're talking about is things like Panescu's paper found that students identified at risk of dropping out after the intervention achieved significantly increased GPAs, passed more classes by 6.4% and stayed in school following a mindset intervention. So what they said that translated to, if they scale that across the US, 1.18 million additional passed courses. So they're looking at the cost benefit of that intervention. That was a one-off online 45-minute intervention delivered to kids on a computer in a computer lab. So or it could be done at home. So they're saying with something that simple, they're suggesting that the return is this. You probably want to scrutinise the science yourself, read through it, see if it holds up. The Fonska found that mindset interventions we talked about this, positively increased IQ test performance for high school students diagnosed with anxiety. But again, the caveat was, that's the heading really of the paper, but the caveat is it was only one IQ subtest item, measured twice at a close interval, so that, where the learning effects and all those things work in. It was a processing speed item, so whether that's the best measure of the factor G, I don't know, probably not. Again, the seminal paper though that probably kicked things off over the last 10 years would have been Blackwell's study, which the longitudinal study, which involved high school students transitioning, and found that mindset intervention, which was an 8-session intervention, so arguably it's still relatively brief, you know, by comparison to say reading recovery, which is 20 weeks, which is something that they use in schools. Reversed or increased declining math grades. Aronson's 2003 study found that students in a mindset intervention conditions achieved high GPAs longitudinally. That was a pen pal activity. There was three 45 minutes just in a university lab that the students completed, I think the bigger differences were for African American students. They seemed to gain more out of it than the non-African American students. In terms of some of the other findings, there has been some unpublished studies. So they're sort of in that grey literature, or they're in things like policy documents. And you know, they've found, for example, that the Brainology program, which was then the commercial product that I guess Blackwell and Duet created following the 2007 study, you know, that resulted in, for example, significant increases in reading achievement in one study by an average of 8 percentile points. In another study involving American Latino middle school students, they achieved a 0.2% increase to their GPA following that same program. And I guess a little bit differently, but still in that kind of brief educative context or brief intervention context, is some of the work as well by Jaeger and Walton. So they've looked at, for example, a brief sense of belonging intervention, which fits under, it's not a mindset intervention per se, but it sort of fits under the bigger banner of what's coming under an academic mindset, and I'll put a slide at the end for that. Their research has showed that it's been able to help close the achievement gap in a study by 40% and increase GPAs. Yes.
You're mixing two different things.
Totally. That one's a different one.
No. But the issue that I'm trying to get at is that basically what you're doing is you're motivating students to try harder on a test that they just done. And then you're saying that's increasing IQ. That's not increasing IQ. That's just meaning that it means that the first test wasn't a valid one because it wasn't their optimal performance. And if you try and tell me that you have a 1 hour intervention that's going to make changes of that ilk, I mean, that's crazy. It doesn't make, so you really need to be a little more critical of some of the research.
Yeah.
Also, something that's done in a small one-on-one sort of setting, and you're saying that when they scale it up, I'm not sure what scale it up, that it has the same effect. That's just not plausible. That just never happens. When you scale something up, you always lose something.
Yep.
Yeah.
That was something that I do have some critiques, so I don't disagree. Yeah.
I'm not even going to dress this up as a question. It's just a comment, and it's sort of in line with what Herb's saying. I've been reading in this literature for a little while, and there's no way that some of these claims and results are, as Herb says, realistic. What I'd really like to see in this area, and in lots of areas, but specifically education, is far more prospectively registered trials, right? Like, there's so much cherry picking going on in these results, and we just need to get more of these studies registered ahead of time with all of the outcomes, so you can't just sort of choose this one outcome that, oh, fantastic, big result. I mean, as Herb said, there's maybe some incredible form of hypnosis could get us a 40% decrease in racial achievement gap, but there's no way, there's nothing you can do in an hour that is going to have that kind of impact. And some of the results that I've seen in this area, and like, I think this is a really interesting area of research and somebody's mindset I can absolutely buy that has a massive impact. But like, some of these really brief interventions that then have 2 year
or 3 years
or 3 years sustained impact.
Yep.
I'm sorry, no. No. We're cherry picking results here. And I'd really like to see far more prospectively registered trials.
Yeah.
Multi-arm trials as well, you know, pitting
Well,
this
that-
intervention against
yeah.
several others.
That would be great. I mean, those obviously are really hard, but registering new trials ahead of time is not hard. We can do that so easily. And absolutely unpacking the different components of interventions and you know, doing factorial designs and so on would be great. But let's just start with registering things ahead of time, because there's just so much cherry picking.
Yeah.
And that's not just to discount anything that you're doing or saying.
Just
It's really
in general.
it's a general comment about these kinds of studies, and then when we see, like, you know, as cited in and it's
As I
like
said,
unpublished.
One of the problems that's coming, one of the problems that
Yeah.
certainly one of the problems that I found, it was a critique. Certainly something that I addressed is that and I do have some critiques, which I'm trying to be balanced, because I do have people from universities as well that they'll come and present to us as psychologists, and even in their own research they show us what they want to show us.
And I'm largely saying this because you do work in the Department of Education, and I think that people in the department need quite a bit of education themselves about the importance of as prospectively registered trials. I mean, they're jumping on these fantastic findings. And why isn't that great? And then running away with themselves.
Yep, I can think of two other universities quite recently that have brought brief interventions. Sort of presented to us with them, both around personality, and I sort of thought that would be pretty.
If it sounds too good to be true, it
probably
is.
Yeah. So I guess the way that they start the introduction of this, I'll just read it out. This idea around, and it's a tricky idea, because I think there's probably some of that Rosenthal effect that could be happening or somebody made another comment about sort of just believing. Believing something is the way it is, and it sort of might increase or have a sort of a placebo sort of effect or something. But they sort of start their discussion on brief educative interventions like this. Several years ago, a brief intervention was introduced in 8 hospitals around the world in an effort to reduce medical errors. The intervention required surgeons and nurses to complete a 1-page checklist of tasks before beginning a surgery, such as introducing themselves to one another and correctly timing the application of anaesthetics. An evaluation of this simple 1-page intervention found that it reduced surgical complications by 36% and deaths by 47%. Observers of the medical profession have wondered how a small intervention could have a large effect, especially when it did not address such clearly important factors such as surgeon skills or training. The Gawan checklist is something that I hadn't been familiar with until sort of the way they introduced that. And I suppose that's kind of what they're trying to, and I guess that was the other thing that I found really hard. These interventions don't address students' literacy or numeracy or their learning outcomes, but yet they seem to be impacting on those things. How is that the case? And that's one thing that I certainly haven't found them explain very well. They just say that it sets in motion a recursive or an iterative process whereby they have an increase in performance, then they have an increase in their beliefs, and it's sort of an upward, or maybe or an upward spiral.
It's like the teacher's capacities or not.
Yeah. But I think, I don't think that the psychomechanics of it has been well explained at all. And again, this was just some research where they did do a large, I think this was almost, they did the mindset, they measured the mindsets, I think, of almost all students in Chile, so they looked at a whole population level, and that they found that the dotted line is obviously a growth mindset, the fixed line was a fixed mindset, or the solid line, and just the differences in standardised test scores, no intervention, just correlate. I think somebody asked about some correlate stuff before. So this is of language and math, so in both the area. Because I think as well, you might find that I would assume you might see changes in math easier than you would in language, because it's, I think, a harder area to sort of measure, but also just the importance of phonological awareness, which I tend to think if those children don't have those skills, it's going to be really hard for them to get to develop those skills just by one set interventions. Some of the research suggests that that might help
the point that Teresa made would also be relevant here. You're sort of assuming that a mindset generalizes across math and language, but I'm sure that it won't.
No. So some people, again, have just looked at it within the subject-specific areas as well, not across all curriculum areas.
No, but do they measure mindset? The outcome measure is math and language,
Yes.
but are the items
Domain-specific mindset.
domain-specific items?
On the mindset scale.
Yeah.
So some
Obviously it can be.
Yeah, some of them, so certainly some of them have. So my math ability is something like unchanged. Some of the research does do it specifically within math, science.
And is there a generalizable mindset that generalizes across the different subjects,
yeah.
or is it very
Right.
domain specific? That was the question.
Correct. Sorry,
I was
okay.
asking.
Okay, sorry then. Yeah, so some researchers looked at both. It's not something that I didn't look at the different areas as such. And again, I think somebody asked about, like say, fixed and growth mindset percentage of students with one. Somebody was asking about that, and then I guess this really just shows across SES status. And I don't think maybe you could just look at then SES status with achievement. You might not have to look at mindset in addition to that. This was with that large sample of, I think from memory, it was almost like they collected, like a whole population study of all public schools in Chile. Yeah.
How was fixed and growth mindset measured?
On that single scale.
I'm reading this graph from one previous
Yeah,
line.
okay.
Then at the two lines in the previous graph
Yeah.
come together for higher income and further apart for low income. And then when you flip to this one, it's the other way around. So it seems like that growth mindset is more valuable for poorer kids and yet fewer of them hold it. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah. So just two Australian studies that have looked at it, and that were two fairly recent Australian studies. So in the first one, this was the study from UNSW where they looked at the mindsets of 87 Indigenous versus non-Indigenous students, and the pathway analysis demonstrated that Indigenous status negatively predicted a growth mindset, so that incremental view of intelligence and ability, but that incremental beliefs were a positive predictor of academic achievement. Of note, there was no direct association between Indigenous status and academic achievement. Instead, the relationship between Indigenous status and achievement seemed to mediate through implicit beliefs. And then they sort of talk a little bit about they sort of allude to why that might be the case. Maybe it's because they've not been expected to have as many growth abilities, so maybe they're not getting as much through from their teachers. I mean, they're very careful with saying that, and I don't think that's necessarily what they are saying. I don't want to be teacher bashing out there, but they do sort of wonder whether maybe the teachers of those students don't expect as much for Indigenous students as they do for non-Indigenous students, whether that might be something that is at play there a little bit. But again, it was the achievement, they said, wasn't because of Indigenous status. They said that there was something else in that study. They said that seemed to have been mediated through mindset. And then again, this is just and with that study too, they also looked at they gave the students like a mock NAPLAN test as well to measure performance. So I think there was 10 literacy, 10 numeracy items, and they sort of used that as a measure as well. And then in the other study from ANU, it was just a larger study of high school students. And they found that the belief that intelligence was fixed was predictive of fewer academic goals, greater learned helplessness or attributions, poorer self-reported grades because they didn't have grades, they just had self-report. How do you think your grades were going? They didn't use an objective measure of grades. And the fixed entity beliefs were also predictive of academic self-handicap and truancy and disengagement. So that critique, quite one of the things, obviously, I'm going to outline some of them. Aronson's didn't collect pre-test data, they just did post-test and then follow-up in terms of mindset, and then looked at how those correlated with academic achievement. So we don't know what they were like at pre-test. They could have been better or worse. It might have been worse. The pen pal intervention might have actually not helped at all. Penescu didn't measure change in mindset at post-test or follow-up. Just said that at pre-test this was the mindset, this is the outcomes You know, Donahoe, Blackwell, and Esperaz all pre-test mean mindset scores were in the growth mindset range. So really, all they showed is that the intervention, the students on average from pre-test were in the growth range. At post-test were in the growth range. So for me, it was like big deal. You know, you're just shown that the intervention moves you slightly up on the growth scale. And Donoghue found that although students showed a significant increase in mindset scores pre to post, at 3 months the scores returned to baseline. So I know somebody asked about the stability of them over time. But these are things that I really haven't found a lot of in the research. It's just sort of been ignored. So I certainly don't ignore it. I raised it. Also the fact that a lot of the research is US based, a lot of the research has to work as an investigator. So I'm completely, you know, I've sort of bring up those types of things as being a concern. Any other comments with that one? That's been some things that people have asked. Oh, sorry, okay. So just the study, I just did a really small intervention, 20 in the intervention group, 20 in the control group, culturally diverse, grades 5 and 6, transitioning from high school. The bottom decile of the socioeconomic advantage, disadvantage, unemployment rate above the state national average, you know, low income level. Again, there was limited research in the area. I couldn't find any intervention studies in Australia. The questions were, what were the mindsets of this sample of primary school students? I found that 60% in that group, as a small sample, admittedly, very small sample, held either a fixed or undecided mindset, and 40 had a group. So growth mindset, gender or cultural background didn't influence those mindset orientations. So, you know, maybe there's some preliminary suggestion there that you know, maybe even at primary school, kids have already made their mind up where they sit in terms of their mindset. Research question again, another hypothesis. I wanted to just look at goal orientation. I found that mindset positively correlated with learning goals, you know, but not with, didn't negatively correlate with performance goals. But again, very small, very small sample size. In terms of just their GPAs, and I know there's problems with taking, you know, turning scales out of letters. I found that on average, students that had a growth mindset had a B grade average across literacy and numeracy, whereas those that had an undecided or a fixed mindset had a C grade average. Again, small sample, only 43 kids, I acknowledge that, but there was a difference there. And then the intervention, so I gave them a 45-minute intervention on a growth mindset, and you know, wanted to know if it had any influence on their beliefs that intelligence was malleable. And obviously there was a difference. The only real other point that I would say is that on average my kids the students I tested started out with an undecided mindset and did move into that growth mindset range at post-test. So that's something that hasn't been, well, I didn't find in any of the other literature. So it might work for those kids. It seems to work well, we know, for kids that already have a growth mindset and probably have an undecided mindset. Don't know if you took a sample of kids that had a really fixed view, if the intervention would work, how it might need to be changed, how it might need to be differentiated, what that might look like. I haven't come across any research that's really looked at that. And the effect size was a small sample, but there was a moderate effect size or nearabouts. And then I also took some work samples. So one of the activities was a postcard to self, and you know, the students, for example, here wrote, "I'm writing to you from the past to say to never give up and to try something new and to try and to don't worry what others think. Even I had problems but got past them." So that helped me to understand that kids did understand the content of the lesson, that they did take on the idea that they have to keep trying and that effort is important. There was also a mind map that they did, and obviously you can tell the difference that this was a boy and this was a girl because of the neat writing. I didn't write this for these kids. They wrote this themselves. So this boy's written what he's talking about, these little neuron comparisons between caged and non-caged animals. So the caged animal, there's like less, and the one that has the stimulating environment, there's more. And he says, what stands out to me is that it shows that animals in a stimulated environment have more neurological connections. So this is a Year 6 kid, but that's pretty, like, they understood the learning content. I didn't write it, I didn't say what to write. They were able to do that. And then what is neuroplasticity? It's where the brain rewires itself to learn new things.
What?
So again, kids can understand these things. Kids can get, some of these...
Where are these kids?
It's the intervention talks a lot about neuroplasticity.
Constantly, there's videos.
Brainology is all about that. Right, brainology, so called.
Was that the intervention, Kris, that you
No,
used brainology?
no, I didn't use the brainology program. I took from the Pertz Academy from Stanford University. They have some free lessons.
Well, does it talk about the brain?
Yep. So it's the same program as brainology, but it's crushed down into 2 lessons.
Yeah, okay.
Rather than being of 8 lessons.
So they
And that's
introduced you to that
Stanford.
terminology.
Right.
Yes. Oh no, sorry. I apologise.
That's what people were being.
They learnt that. I didn't write their answers. I didn't tell them.
No.
Because teachers can be up there and saying, "Okay, kids, this is what you need to write." This is, No, that wasn't the case. So for me, that's pretty good that Year 6 kids can take that from that. To me, it shows that they understood the content. There was learning that was happening.
Sure.
Yeah. So some of the implications, possibly by grades 5 and 6, students may have already made up their minds whether they are or aren't capable learners. I don't know if that's a new thing or not a new thing. And that's probably going to have some impact on future learning and setbacks. Practices that foster a growth mindset are becoming recognised in some studies, we'll acknowledge, as a powerful tool for struggling disadvantaged students. And then I think it's important, as I think it's been said, replicate, scale it up. What are you losing? What else might be happening at the school which might account for those changes? Can you really control for all of the instructional learning, all the variables that might be going on? Probably not. But they talk about the idea that they are cost effective, they may have a potential to narrow some achievement gap. Again, we talked about the mindset of the teacher as being important, or that of the school. They're just interesting questions that might need to be considered. And then I think just in terms of, that broader thing now of academic mindsets as opposed to a growth mindset, they're sort of talking about this idea of a sense of belonging. So I belong as a learner that fits into this school, or I don't belong as a learner, and that seems to be having an impact on student achievement. So kids that do disengage, I'd probably say they aren't connected with school. They don't feel that they belong as a learner there. Self-efficacy, which we know, growth mindset and relevance, this work has value for me. So that's that broadening now, where it's probably moved just from growth mindset to academic mindset. So that's just in terms of the protocol. As I said, 2 studies I used that was based on 2 studies, Panescu's and Blackwell's, 2 1-hour sessions. They were the 2 overview of the 2 lessons, and linked it into a few curriculum things there, state policy, Melbourne Declaration.
Is that...
Sorry. I can... Yep, otherwise I can give you a quick view of what the intervention looked like, but otherwise that would be it.
Okay, I think the thing I'd love to know is, okay, here you are, you're in the Department for Education, you've read a lot of this stuff, you've done some of it yourself. If you now wanted to improve kids' academic performance and well-being, what would you do next?
For the academic side of things, I certainly think the feedback is really, and I think the research speaks to that the feedback is really important, and the way that you give the...
I think I want to broaden it out. Would you just be focusing on mindset, or would you focus on others?
Oh, so that brought that more of a broader model. No, I'd probably look at at more things too. I'd look at their sense of belonging. I think that the area in that space has been quite important. I think, looking at their well-being more generally is certainly important. Tying those things together, definitely. I mean, for me, it's just one. The wellbeing framework has cognitive wellbeing as one element of the 5 domains. There is not much that they've spoken to about cognitive wellbeing. So for me, this is just one way of saying, you know what, there's some cognitive wellbeing stuff out there. Cognitive wellbeing, is associated with achievement and success. The middle one here, achievement and success, informed by motivation, persistence to achieve. Cognitive wellbeing is important, except as being a positive learner. So that's an area that schools struggle with, but there's all the areas of wellbeing that they talk about in the framework. So for me, this is just work on one area that I've sort of looked at and working on.
Well,
sorry.
Thank you. We've got. Thank you very much, Kris. We'll just say thanks, and then we can ask further questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to come and talk and the questions, because I think that's the most important thing, to get the questions to go, yes, I know there are some problems with these types of things, but you don't get it unless people don't question. Is it on that note, if you have any questions, let me know, or I'll probably give some details and you can ask as well to me, email or something.
Thanks, Kris.